The second season of Sonic Prime just released a few days ago on Netflix. Well, I guess it's more of a part 2 rather than a season 2, but that's just what Netflix calls it. Well, if you want to call it anything, I think good actually fits it pretty well. Because after watching all 8 episodes, I'd say this second part is way better than the first in almost every way. Before I do get into things though, there will be spoilers for all of Sonic Prime, so if you haven't finished watching the new episodes or haven't started watching it at all, I recommend you do that first. Now with a spoiler warning out of the way, let's get right into Sonic Prime Season 2. The first thing I want to talk about with this second batch of episodes is the story, and to begin with, I'd like to go over how the multiverse is used in this show's story. The multiverse as a concept is one that has been pretty heavily done as of late, and some media has done the multiverse as a concept really well.
This is unbelievable.
This is the lobby.
Some decent enough.
What did you expect?
And others have been pretty underwhelming.
I'm sorry, Stephen.
And I think Sonic Prime's use of the multiverse fits somewhere kind of right in the middle of all of that. I do think the show maybe could have done more with it, but I also don't think it's been done poorly in the show either. The reason I bring this up is because the second part of Sonic Prime doesn't have to establish the multiverse or introduce it anymore. That was all done in Part 1. There were times in Part 1 that kinda lagged and were pretty boring, and while I do think they were important to setting up the multiple universes, Part 2 has the luxury of not needing to do any of that, and can instead focus on moving the plot forward in a more meaningful way than, oh hey, look at this new quirky universe, I wonder what version of Sonic's friends exist here. So now that the multiverse concept has been set up and thoroughly traversed in the show, the story moves on to conflicts between multiple heroes and villains. The story for Part 2 mainly revolves around these guys, the Chaos Council, trying to gather all the shards in every universe to use them for various evil purposes. Pretty usual Eggman shenanigans. That on its own isn't super new or inventive as a concept, but what makes all the universe jumping in this part interesting are the character interactions and the way their relationships build throughout the story. Take Captain Dread, the Knuckles from the Pirate universe, as an example. Dread initially uses Sonic as a way to get his treasure back from the Chaos Council, and then tries to get his crew to turn on Sonic for quote-unquote abandoning them while in battle. A simple character motivation, but one that provides Sonic with more conflicts than just the Chaos Council, as now he has a pirate captain chasing him around for most of this part of the show. Another interesting dynamic is between Sonic and Shadow, which is set up in the first episode of this new batch. I think I'll save Shadow's actual character for a bit later on, because this is genuinely one of the best Shadow adaptations we've seen in a very, very long time. But regardless, Sonic and Shadow's team-up dynamic is one that provides a bunch of amazing moments in Part 2. This part of Sonic Prime is largely focused on the character interactions as well as action scenes, but the main driving force is still the shards of the Paradox Prism, which, speaking of, by this point in the story, the Chaos Council is now jumping between universes in order to try and retrieve them all. We learn in one of the later episodes that the Council is working to conquer and then divide, so their plan is to use the shards and have each member conquer and take over a specific universe so that they may do whatever they want with it. Moments like these build onto the more character-focused moments in this part, and they make the Chaos Council feel like they have a bit more than just one dimension, which was definitely an issue in Part 1, although maybe that isn't applicable to all of them. To wrap up this segment on the story of Part 2, we get a lot of answers throughout this part as to what the Shatter Space is and how it all can be fixed back together, which is what Sonic's main goal throughout this part becomes, and that on top of all of the rest that I just talked about comes together to really feel like the plot is moving somewhere, rather than just Sonic running away from the Chaos Council and jumping into new universes, which is pretty much all that Part 1 was. The second thing I'd like to go over are the characters. I briefly mentioned a few of them, such as Shadow, Dread, and the Chaos Council, but I'll expand a bit on some of them, and also talk about more characters that I think really deserve the spotlight in this part. For the most part, and I say that because there are some exceptions, the characters in Sonic Prime are really starting to come to life, and some of them are actually super interesting ideas that I think work really well in a Sonic story. I already mentioned how Dread tried to convince his pirate crew that Sonic quote-unquote abandoned them, but in a very hypocritical move later on, he does that exact same thing and abandons his crew to get his treasure back from the Chaos Council, really showing where his true desires lie, and I'm interested to see how they'll wrap up his story in Part 3. The next one I want to talk about is Shadow, and honestly, I don't even really feel like I should, because I think Shadow in this show deserves an entire video on his own, but I will say that despite coming off as his typical edgelord self in Part 1, Part 2 does a really good job of establishing him as a character that just wants to get his home back, and he tries to do so by himself, but is forced to work with Sonic and the others because although he may be powerful, he still needs the help of others to do things that he can't himself. And seeing him admit that was honestly kind of shocking, because Shadow, ever since probably Sonic 06, has been a character that was wildly misunderstood and written very poorly, so seeing that he does seem to have a semblance of his old character back was really cool. Oh, and he smiles again. Shadow is back! The Chaos Council this time around does get more time to shine, and while Dr. Dont's dialogue may be extremely cringy, I think a character like Mr. Dr. Eggman, what kinda name, does get some really nice character moments. There's two specifically that I really liked. The first is when he tries to convince the council that he should be the one to rule over New York, which is what leads to their conquer and then divide strategy. But I think what's been hidden behind Mr. Dr. Eggman in this part, which was shown in his overall lack of interest and confidence in the Chaos Council, is that he seems to have an ulterior motive to be the one true ruler over everything. And while that's just speculation, I would really like for him to turn out that way, because so far, his character has just been sitting on the sidelines, except for the other moment that I enjoyed, which really reminded me of that Sonic Adventure 2 moment where Dr. Eggman tricks Tails into telling him that the Chaos Emerald he has is a fake. You probably know what I'm talking about, but anyways, back to Sonic Prime. Mr. Dr. Eggman takes Nine, who has been a prisoner of the Chaos Council for most of this part, and tries to get him to invent something to defeat Sonic, to which Nine says he pretty much can't because he doesn't think like Sonic does, and that only Sonic could defeat Sonic. But that actually gives Mr. Dr. Eggman exactly what he wanted, and led to him creating Chaos Sonic, which is an alternate version of Metal Sonic powered by the shards of the Paradox Prism. It may not seem all that crazy explaining it here, but it was a moment of trickery from Mr. Dr. Eggman that I really want to see more of in Part 3, and I really hope we get to see it. The final character I really enjoyed in this part was more of a dynamic between two characters, and that was Sonic and Nine. Their dynamic is one that is really interesting to see and watch, because Sonic just sees Nine as his best friend Tails, and because of that, can't help but trust him no matter what he says or does. And the effect this has on Nine is maybe not one of necessarily manipulation or jealousy, but Nine really wants to be seen for who he is on his own by the end of this part, rather than just Sonic's friend Tails. By the end of the last episode for this part, Nine pretty much betrays Sonic and takes the shards for himself to a place called the Grim, and wants to use them to make a new world that he enjoys, instead of just restoring his old world, which was one that he hated. And I mean, can you really blame him? Some of the best antagonists are one where you can see their point of view and how it makes sense to them. The moment where Sonic really sees the betrayal of Nine is honestly pretty sad, and he tries to convince him to stay, but eventually he does leave. It's going to be really interesting seeing how their dynamic furthers in Part 3, and I can definitely see Shadow getting back at Sonic for being so trusting. But that is what makes Sonic, Sonic. And actually speaking of, Sonic himself as a character is, well, I think he's better than he was in Part 1, but he still comes off as overly annoying and hyper, and not too focused on actually setting things right, at least not 100% of the time. I don't really want to get into Sonic's character here, one because I said Nine was the last character I wanted to talk about, and two, because I just don't really enjoy Sonic's character, and I think this is a weaker adaptation of his character that feels more like the 2010 Sonic, which is almost universally seen as not the greatest. He's just kind of annoying, plain and simple, and that's really all I want to say about him at this point. Now we move on to pretty much everything else, which I think has improved since Part 1, and that's the things like voice acting, animation, and honestly really well done action scenes. There is a lot of action in Part 2, and each time I think the animation team is going to run out of ideas, they come up with a new idea to make the action interesting or creatively new. It's not like Monty Oum levels of good, but it's a lot more than just characters punching each other, which is pretty important when there's this much action in the show. This goes along with the animation overall just looking cleaner this part, probably due to the animation team getting into the flow with Sonic Prime's style now. But either way, I do have to give some appreciation towards the animation team, because the animation in the show is really good. Oh, and they also reference a ton of iconic Sonic moments throughout this part, which I think is really cool. The voice acting in this part is just as good as it was in Part 1, if not even better. Every character from Part 1 that was good is still just as good, but the new characters like Shadow especially sound almost perfect. I don't want to go as far as to say it's my favorite voice for Shadow yet, but I think it's pretty close to topping Griffith's take on the character, which is something I didn't think I would ever say. Other than Shadow, I think the characters that interact with their alternate selves also do a pretty good job at making each character sound and feel unique in the moment, which is pretty important to distinguishing each character. My favorite example is probably when Renegade Nux and Dread fight, and you can easily tell who is who. Phew, that was a lot of Sonic Prime, but it was well deserved in my opinion. This may not be the best Sonic show out there, although it hasn't even finished yet, so who knows, but I really do enjoy it. I know some out there aren't very fond of Sonic's character, and while I definitely don't love his characterization or anything, I do think he's at least tolerable most of the time, and usually he's fighting or just yelling random lines, so the good moments come from the actually really enjoyable characters. Although in this part, he does get some really good moments, like the one with 9 that I explained earlier. And while it may not be the best Sonic show, that doesn't mean it isn't enjoyable. In fact, it's quite the contrary. I think this might be the most fun and action-packed Sonic show out there. Sonic X might be the most faithful adaptation of Sonic, and Sonic Boom might have the most comedic moments, but I think Sonic Prime is just fun all the way through. Well, at least for part 2 that is, which is why I made this video about it. I'd really like to see more Sonic-related shows from this studio, and with the crew they have, and I'm now really looking forward to seeing how things wrap up in part 3. As usual, thanks for watching the video, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more Sonic-related content in the future. I've been trying to have a somewhat consistent schedule here, but we'll see how that turns out. Anyways, thanks for sticking around until the end, and I'll see you next time.